former President Trump's January 6th case could still unravel before this year's election. District Court Judge Tanya Chutkan recently ruled against his bid to toss the case, and now she's preparing for a conference later this month to figure out where things go from here ahead of a presidential election like no other. To talk more about this, we're joined now by The Hill's White House reporter, Brett Samuels. Brett, Trump's January 6th case is back in the hands of District Court Judge Tanya Chutkan after the Supreme Court sent it back to the lower courts. And Chutkan has scheduled an August 16th conference to map out the course of this case. What's next?
Yeah, so that August 16th hearing that you mentioned is certainly going to be very important in sort of determining the path forward. Certainly, a number of things need to be sorted out here. Both sides, both Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case, and Trump's defense attorneys need to sort of put forward how they see this case playing out. And Judge Chutkan, most importantly, needs to sort of unwind what Trump can actually be held liable for, what he could be put on trial for after the Supreme Court granted wide presidential immunity for official acts in office. So Judge Chutkan needs to sort out kind of what in this case would fall under official acts and what could still be put on trial. So certainly lots to be sorted through here, but I would expect, based on what we've seen from Judge Chutkan, that August 16th hearing will be the start of sort of a flurry of activity. And this case may actually move quite quickly once the two sides are in court and they're able to sort some of these initial procedural things out.
Well, Trump is scheduled to hold a Mar-a-Lago conference later today. What do you think we can expect from that?
Yeah, this news conference that the former president has called, it's always kind of unpredictable what he'll do when he calls these sort of last minute impromptu events. Certainly, I think this is sort of transparently an attempt by Trump to seize back the news cycle. Vice President Harris, basically for the last 2 or 3 weeks, ever since she was elevated to the top of the Democratic ticket, has really owned the news cycle. She's been in the spotlight. She's dominated media coverage. That has continued this week when she named her running mate. And former President Trump has made pretty clear that he's not fond of that. He's sort of raged on Truth Social about how he's upset about the coverage of Vice President Harris. So this news conference, I think you can expect him to be fairly combative. I think you can expect him to attack Vice President Harris, but certainly I think he's looking to make waves on his own to sort of pull back some of that attention that Vice President Harris has garnered.
Well, speaking of running mates, vice presidential nominees Vance and Walls both hold military records, we know, but specifics over their years of service have come under attack, right? Vance is questioning Walls' service after retiring, accusing him of stolen valor. And then you have Mark Kelly jumping in, attacking Vance for making those comments. So can you explain what's going on here?
Yeah, certainly when Tim Walz was selected, there was a lot of attention on the fact that he is a veteran, that he served in the Army National Guard, enlisted when he was 17. But as you mentioned, J.D. Vance and Republicans have actually turned this into a line of attack. They've gone after Governor Walz. Specifically, they've focused on this idea of whether Governor Walz sort of ducked out of being deployed to a combat zone. He retired from the National Guard in 2005, and then just a month or two later, his unit shipped out overseas into combat in Iraq. And there have been sort of people who, Senator Vance among them, who have claimed, this is stolen valor, that he was ducking, serving overseas in a combat zone. And Senator Vance, of course, served in the Marines previously. But Governor Walz, his allies, they've really pushed back aggressively on that. They've said, that he was not skirting serving overseas, and B, that, they've essentially questioned this idea of attacking someone's military service. They've said that's out of bounds, that folks should be, grateful for anyone who chooses to serve in the armed forces. So I think this bears watching whether this continues to be a line of attack and whether it resonates with voters, since this is something Republicans are clearly interested in highlighting.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a big topic of the moment. But switching gears here a little bit, Gaza protesters interrupted a campaign rally in Detroit. And we know that Vice President Harris has been aligned with President Biden, vowing her support for Israel. So what is Walz' stance? Is it any different? And do you think this will impact the progressives in this election in terms of voting?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when Vice President Harris was sort of sorting through who her potential running mates were, we heard from progressives who said that Tim Walz would have been one of their preferred picks. They liked sort of his views on the situation in the Middle East and Israel, the war in Gaza. But at the end of the day, his views are pretty closely aligned with Vice President Harris, and really with a broad swath of the Democratic Party, where he is supportive of Israel. Certainly, he has spoken out against anti-Semitism, and he's spoken out and condemned aspects of protests on campuses that spurred up over the war in Gaza. And that's pretty similar to what we've seen a lot of Democrats do, including President Biden, including Vice President Harris. So obviously, we heard from these protesters at the vice president's rally in Detroit. Michigan is home to a really high Arab American population. So that certainly could play a role moving forward in that state, which is a key battleground. But I think the fact that we heard from those protesters last night is just a sign that picking Tim Walz and Vice President Harris replacing President Biden atop the ticket is not going to single-handedly convince these voters to back down to vote for the Democratic ticket. And this is going to be something that they're going to have to work on and contend with, I think, for the last 3 months of this campaign.
Right. And also in Detroit, the president of the United Automobile Workers rallied for Harris, really tearing into Trump. So with Harris having supportive unions, how bad is this for Trump?
Yeah, certainly Sean Fain, the UAW president, there is no love lost between him and former President Trump. They've really been going at it for the last few months, sort of trading insults, trading barbs. And in Detroit on Wednesday night, we saw him really in sort of rare form going after Trump, saying he doesn't know anything about the auto industry, hailing Kamala Harris, saying that she stands for workers where Trump stands for billionaires. This is something that has sort of been playing out even when President Biden was on the ticket, this idea that union leadership, and specifically the UAW, which is important in Michigan, has backed the Democratic ticket. They're backing Vice President Harris now. Former President Trump has sort of tried to make inroads with union workers. He's argued that union workers, the rank and file, will support him even if leadership doesn't. But the fact is unions play a big role in states like Michigan, in states like Nevada, where there's a big organized labor presence, in Las Vegas. So I think the appeal to union workers from the Democratic ticket and the focus on winning those voters over could certainly play a big role in an election that's only going to be decided by, a few thousand votes in a few different states.
Well, new polling shows that Harris and Trump are virtually tied in Georgia. What do you think it is about Harris that puts a state like Georgia back in play? And what do you think her biggest vulnerabilities are there?
Yeah, certainly Georgia, we've seen in the poll that you mentioned and just sort of polling in the immediate aftermath of her replacing Biden on the ticket, that she has really surged in a state like Georgia that seemed to be out of reach for Democrats just a few weeks ago. And I think a big part of that is certainly Black voters, who played a huge role in 2020 in boosting President Biden to a win in that state. They have really rallied behind Vice President Harris after sort of cooling on President Biden. So that and, Democratic voters in general, sort of the base, have really rallied behind Vice President Harris. So I think those are two key factors to sort of her rise in the polls in Georgia in particular. But certainly it's a state where I think it's fair to say that former President Trump is probably still slightly favored. That poll you mentioned did show him up by just a couple percentage points in a race against Harris. And Harris, she remains vulnerable on certain issues like the economy. Inflation is obviously a big issue. Certainly former President Trump is going to hammer her on issues like crime in cities like Atlanta. So, and certainly he's going to go after the prosecutor in Atlanta who brought charges against him personally. So, Georgia's still a pretty Republican state, but President Biden showed in 2020 that certainly a Democrat could win it. So, Vice President Harris has definitely put it back in play and back on the map for November.
Yeah, it could definitely be an interesting development. But other polling shows that support for Biden among South Asian Americans was down before he ultimately dropped out. But now with Harris on the ticket, it's sort of the opposite. So how big of an impact could this revival among that particular community have in the race?
I think it could be pretty significant, actually. Asian Americans, they're sort of the fastest growing demographic in the country. So they're playing an increasingly important role in elections. The Harris campaign has really sort of made a concerted effort to reach out to Asian American voters. Obviously, Vice President Harris is the first woman of South Asian descent, I should say, to become vice president. She would make similar history if she were elected president. So there is that heritage factor that she certainly may resonate more with those voters than President Biden did. But I think the Asian American vote is certainly one that neither side can afford to take for granted because it is so important. It is growing in numbers, and it could be enough again in a really close election to tip the scales to one candidate or the other.
Well, Harris and Walls are making stops in Michigan and Wisconsin, hoping to build some campaign momentum in the so-called blue wall states. What do we know about how they're being perceived there so far? Post Walls' announcement, are we seeing any notable changes?
Yeah, I mean, to start off, polling has really shown a really close race. And again, where President Biden was, trailing in some of these states or neck and neck with former President Trump, Vice President Harris has seen a boost. There's a poll that showed her dead even with Harris and Trump were dead even in Wisconsin. Michigan, there was a recent poll that showed Harris up on Trump. And Pennsylvania, another blue wall state, has been really close. But those are the three states that Harris and Walls debuted in. And certainly, if the crowds are any indication, Democrats are really fired up about this ticket. They're really excited in a way that did not manifest itself when President Biden was on the ticket. President Biden would draw, crowds to these smaller venues, and he would speak and he would leave. And there wasn't this great sense of excitement like there is with Vice President Harris. She and Tim Walz spoke in Michigan at an airplane hangar in Detroit or outside Detroit, and the campaign said there were 15,000 people in attendance at that Detroit rally, which was the largest rally that Democrats have had this entire cycle. So certainly voters are packing in to see Vice President Harris and Tim Walz and to check out this new ticket. So there does seem to be this really strong sense of excitement in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania that didn't exist before, and that's certainly good news for Democrats.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's a bit of a sugar high going on, but we know there are some Democrats that are still really vulnerable heading into November, right? And we've learned that some of them are even opting out of the DNC convention coming up just next week. So can you tell us a little bit more about this? Who's not attending and specifically why not?
Yeah, so to your point, not everyone is sort of caught the fever here and jumped on the bandwagon as the Democrats have changed the presidential ticket. But folks who are skipping the DNC, it's basically a handful of sort of vulnerable Democrats in the Senate, in the House. Jon Tester in Montana, for example, a senator in Montana who's up for re-election in November, has said that he will not be attending. I would keep an eye out for similar sort of lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers in red states or purple states. Ruben Gallego, the Arizona Senate candidate, will be interesting to see if he attends. And there's a handful of House candidates as well who are in these sort of purple or red leaning districts who I think are trying to still sort of thread this needle of, supporting the Democratic ticket, but not tying themselves too closely to it because that invites Republican attacks against them heading into November. So it will be interesting to see certainly how many lawmakers choose not to attend in Chicago in a couple of weeks. But Jon Tester, a great example of somebody who's in a tough re-election race and doesn't want to associate himself too closely with the top of the ticket just yet.
Yeah, well, another Democrat, Cori Bush, is now launching a full-scale attack on AIPAC after she lost her primary race. And she's saying that she's only going to become more radical now during her time left in Congress. Do we know if the White House is responding to this at all?
Yeah, so the White House was actually asked about her comments, sort of going after AIPAC, saying she was going to, quote unquote, tear down their kingdom, as she put it. And the White House actually, pushed back fairly strongly on those comments from Congresswoman Bush. The press secretary at the White House called them divisive, inflammatory, and stressed that at a time when lawmakers should be sort of lowering the rhetoric, lowering the temperature, or trying to do that anyway, that the White House didn't really view those comments from the Congresswoman as particularly helpful. So certainly notable to see the White House kind of pushing back on commentary from a fellow Democrat. And certainly Cori Bush, she's the second member of the Squad, the progressive group of lawmakers to lose their primary. Jamal Bowman, of course, lost his primary in New York just a few weeks back. So it will certainly, as you said, be interesting to see what those lawmakers do in sort of their finite time left in Congress now, whether this makes them more willing to kind of step out of line with the party and speak out, or if they go quietly in their last few months in office.
Brett Samuels, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nonprofit World Central Kitchen is reporting that one of their staff members was killed in Gaza just 4 months after an Israeli airstrike killed another 7 of their workers. The organization, which provides food and aid to civilians, identified Nadi Salut as the worker killed. Founder and celebrity chef Jose Andres called him a humanitarian at his very core. World Central Kitchen says they're still looking into what happened, and they say they believe the worker was off duty at the time of being killed. The Israeli government has since denied knowing about Salut's death. And the Minnesota Supreme Court is upholding a law that restores the right to vote for individuals with felony convictions. The court upheld the 2023 law that allows felons to vote once they've completed their prison sentences. The law is popular with Democrats in the North Star state. In fact, Tim Walz, the state's governor and newly announced running mate to Vice President Harris, first signed the law. The decision comes as early voting is underway for the state's primary election next week. And NASA is reporting the Boeing Starliner crew's return from the International Space Station may be delayed until 2025. And now the administration is suggesting that they may need the help of the Boeing competitor SpaceX to return the astronauts back to Earth. Officials say that if the Starliner cannot make the journey back from the ISS, SpaceX's Crew Dragon could be used in February of 2025. NASA's Commercial Crew Program Manager has said that no official decisions have been made yet about the crew's return. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Bianca Facchinei. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.